Greetings everyone, I'm Adam Haritan. Welcome to the beautiful woods of Western Pennsylvania. Today we are going to talk about one of my favorite kinds of ecosystems to explore, to learn, and to dispel some myths about. That kind of ecosystem is this one right here, the old growth forest. When we think of old growth forests, we probably think of many things: old trees, big trees, large mossy logs on the forest floor, maybe a Sasquatch sighting or two, maybe a sense of pristineness, and perhaps even perfection. These are all decent images to think about, and in many cases, most of them do accurately depict many old growth forests today. But because of things like large-scale logging, agriculture, and development, old growth forests aren't as common as they used to be, and we might find ourselves romanticizing these somewhat rare ecosystems today and imagining things that aren't actually true. Over the past year, I've been visiting different old growth forests and documenting them for an online course that I'm creating on old growth forest ecology. And through my travels and explorations, I've encountered many myths and misconceptions surrounding these ecosystems. Now, to be clear, when I say old growth forest, I'm not implying that all old growth forests are the same. Conditions in one particular forest, let's say in Northern California, can be very different than those in another forest, let's say in South Carolina. But there are some commonalities that many old growth forests share, and as a result, there are some general myths and misconceptions that people perpetuate about these ecosystems. In this video, we're going to talk about these myths specifically regarding the old growth forests on the continent I inhabit, North America, and more specifically in the country I live in, the United States. Now, I know it sounds like a weird place to begin, but I want to start with the "Make America blank again" phrases. Many years ago, I remember when these phrases started popping up, and I'm sure you remember them too. So of course there was, and there still is, "Make America great again." There's "Make America healthy again." And there have also been some pretty novel phrases like "Make America kind again" and "Make America smile again." But I also remember seeing for the first time many years ago a phrase that went like this: "Make America an endless expanse of old growth forest with no certain borders again." Now, the "no certain borders" thing I won't comment on, but the first part of the phrase is very relevant to our discussion because it implies that, at least in the centuries immediately preceding European settlement, America was an endless expanse of old growth forest. But was it really? Well, it's true that old growth forests were much more common centuries ago than they are today in the United States. But these forests weren't necessarily endless and unbroken. Wetlands like bogs, fens, and marshes were common. Prairies, grasslands, and barrens occupied vast stretches of land. Native American villages and cultivated fields were common. Even some forests were undoubtedly young and early successional. Now, old growth forests were certainly common prior to European settlement, but this idea that America was an endless expanse of nothing but old growth forest is a myth. The entire landscape was, in reality, a diverse and dynamic ecological mosaic actively shaped by indigenous land management practices, along with many other forces, resulting in a complex patchwork of ecosystems, some of which remain, many of which have been destroyed. Now, when we talk about old growth forests today, we might use certain words to describe them. Words like immaculate and pristine. Or we might use words like undisturbed and untouched to describe these landscapes. The issue with these words is that they're kind of subjective and not always accurate in their depiction of old growth forests. How much disturbance, for example, can a forest experience before it's no longer considered undisturbed? How much touching can a forest experience before it's no longer considered untouched? Generally speaking, forests that were logged in the past few centuries, or those that were significantly impacted by human land use changes associated with European settlement, are no longer considered old growth. But even the forests that escaped large-scale logging and agriculture still experienced and continue to experience disturbance. And this is something that might surprise some people. Disturbance isn't absent from old growth forests. It is essential to old-growth forest dynamics, and in many cases, disturbance is how an old-growth forest perpetuates itself. There's a concept in ecology known as gap phase dynamics, which sounds incredibly complex, but actually isn't. Gap phase dynamics describes how many forests regenerate and maintain their diverse structure following the death of one or a few dominant trees. When a tree dies, a gap in the canopy is created. When a gap is created, the forest floor receives a sudden increase in sunlight. Trees that were formerly suppressed in the understory, or plants that require a lot of sunlight, now have more resources to grow. All of this drives regeneration, and it drives biodiversity. Now, when we hear the word untouched in the context of old-growth forests, we might think it means lack of human activity, and we might think that when humans do engage with old-growth forests, that these forests cease to be old growth. Interestingly, however, human activity has been and still is a common component of many old-growth forests. Think about old-growth forests today. In many cases, humans remove invasive species, they apply insecticides to trees, they forage for plants and mushrooms, they hunt and fish, they maintain trails and roads, they selectively cut trees. And yet, many of us still consider these forests to be old growth and perhaps even pristine, even though human activity has influenced them. Now, human engagement with old growth forests isn't a new thing, and modern humans aren't the first humans to ever interact with forests. A lot of old growth forests in North America were strongly influenced by human activity prior to European settlement. Specifically, I'm referring to Native American burning practices, which not only helped to maintain other ecosystems like prairies and grasslands, but also kept many forests open, park-like, and oftentimes more like woodlands and savannas rather than dense, dark forests. Now, of course, periodic, low to moderate intensity burns ignited by indigenous humans didn't and still don't have nearly the same effect that catastrophic wildfires and large-scale clear-cuts do. Obviously, these latter kinds of disturbances are on a different level. But to say that all old-growth forests are and were untouched and free from disturbance is a myth. Wind, ice, insects, fungi, fire, and yes, even humans have been and will continue to be integral components of these ecosystems. Now, if I were to pose the question, what is a common feature of old-growth forests? I think many of us might say, well, old-growth forests contain big trees. And that's a good answer, because many old-growth forests do indeed contain big trees. But interestingly, many old-growth forests don't just contain big trees. Some people are surprised to hear that many old-growth forests actually contain more smaller trees than they do bigger trees. And it's not like these forests are any less old growth or less special because they contain small trees. A commonly cited characteristic, actually, of many old growth forests is that they have multi-layered canopies with trees of all sizes, some that are tall and reach the canopy, some that are medium-sized and occupy middle layers of the forest, and some that are small and reside in the understory. Now, what's perhaps even more interesting than the fact that a high percentage of trees in an old-growth forest can be small is the fact that these smaller trees aren't always young. In fact, small trees can be quite old. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, research has shown that some suppressed western hemlock trees under 4.5 feet tall are over 150 years old. Now, 150 years old isn't even close to being the maximum reported age for this species, but 150 years is still not super young either, and it just goes to show that small trees can be much older than we might imagine them to be. Along the Niagara Escarpment, there are northern white cedar trees that aren't that large, but they've been shown to be centuries, even over 1,000 years old. And what's so fascinating about these trees is that because of their stunted size and overall gnarled appearance, they evaded the scrutiny of researchers until the late 1980s. When researchers finally analyzed them, they discovered that some of these trees were 500, 700, 900, even over 1,000 years old, making them the oldest trees along the Niagara Escarpment. So size isn't the best indicator of age. Many old-growth forests contain lots of small trees, and some or many of these small trees might surprisingly be a lot older than we think. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, old growth forests differ, sometimes drastically, in composition, structure, and function. And it can be really difficult for us to confidently say, all old growth forests are like this, or all old growth forests are like that. And perhaps this is the biggest misconception of all, that the old growth forest ecosystem itself can easily be defined. All we have to do is spend some time visiting old growth forests to see just how different they can be. From second growth forests for sure, but also from other old growth forests, even those that might exist nearby. This is why if we search for a definition of old growth forest and try to figure out what exactly it is, we discover quite quickly that there is no single universally agreed upon definition. Yes, most definitions do mention something about the forests themselves being relatively old and containing relatively old trees, and that these forests, at least in North America, haven't been heavily impacted by significant human land use practices associated with European settlement. But beyond these few conditions, any universal definition of what an old growth forest is breaks down. And it can be difficult for us to say for sure what else all old growth forests have in common. Despite the challenges in trying to come up with a single good definition, the things we discussed in this video, I think, are at least relevant to many old growth forests in North America and can help us understand them a bit more. And if you haven't spent much time doing so, I strongly encourage you to explore and to learn these remarkable and dynamic ecosystems. Because that's what they are. They're not just assemblages of trees, they are dynamic ecosystems comprising an untold number of intimate connections, most of which we know next to nothing about, but are still really rewarding to try to figure out anyway. And if you enjoyed this video, please stay tuned for my upcoming online course on old growth forest ecology, which should be available in a few months. And if you'd like to learn more about that and stay in touch and receive updates, head on over to learnyourland.com and sign up for the email newsletter. And in the meantime, check out my other online courses that are currently open for enrollment on ecosystem ecology, tree identification, and mushroom foraging. Thanks so much for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. I will see you on the next one.